So we're now going to move on to our second presenter for this session, Robert Engen from Canadian Forces College. So we're going to have a different perspective here, another defense related again, but coming from a different perspective. So Robert, good morning, good to see you. If you're ready to share your slides, then by all means, take it away.
All set. All right, can you see that?
We can.
Perfect. Even 2 years into the pandemic, I always want to check. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Engen. I am an academic faculty member at the Canadian Forces College, which is our Armed Forces senior establishment for professional military education. This is my first Connections North conference. I am a huge wargaming fan, but this is the first opportunity I've had to join in the fun here. So thank you very much for the invitation. Over the next few minutes, I want to give you a gentle introduction to the wargaming program as it exists at the Canadian Forces College. I've been at CFC working in professional military education for 3 years now, and it's far and away the most rewarding work I've ever done. But it's become all the more rewarding now that wargaming has become quite mainstream and a major tool for delivering curriculum at CFC. Nevertheless, what we do at CFC is significantly less refined and systematized than what you'll see done at DRDC or the Joint Warfare Center. Now, you can read my bio on the conference program, but what it doesn't say is how many thousands of hours of my youth were spent devoted to role-playing games, board games, war games, and trying to puzzle out what makes them tick and how they could be better adapted to do what I wanted and needed them to do. And I've taken that ill-spent youth and have been trying to adapt that ethos to rebuild a robust wargaming capability at CFC. So I want to go through a few things, the wargaming needs, the unique wargaming needs we've had at CFC, some of the tools in our toolbox, and then I will finish off by going over some of the basically the 4 streams of games that we've been working on, and as well as the elective wargaming class that I've been teaching. So I've always been a big fan of Tom Mowatt's delineation of the applications of wargaming. So I've put it here to show where we fall. It draws some differentiation between focusing on wargaming for analysis and research and wargaming for training and education. And at CFC, we're very much on the training and education side of the equation. A lot of professional wargames are on analysis and research as an adjunct to operational research and analysis. Our objective at CFC, however, has very little to do with the outcomes of the games and is much more about process and substituting wargaming for traditional seminars, threaded discussions, and the like. We are all about helping future decision makers and leaders analyze their own decisions, dissect their processes, and consider major issues that are raised in the curriculum. The outcomes of the games don't particularly matter except insofar as the participants' learning objectives were met. That said, I believe that wargaming and war games are some of the most effective means of learning those objectives that we possess. For a long time, the only systematic wargaming that was done at CFC was part of OPP, the operational planning process, which is taught in our Joint Command and Staff program, and which at the end of it calls for a course of action wargame, a COA wargame. There's never really time at CFC to ever execute even these COA wargames to the fullest extent that they're supposed to be executed. Once upon a time, I understand there was a gaming and simulation cell at the college, but that was phased out and disbanded about a decade ago and never included, to the best of my knowledge, civilian staff. When the COVID pandemic began in early 2020, the Canadian Forces College, as an organization, discovered that its nimbleness and flexibility had to grow 10 sizes in one day, or else our program was not going to work. Like everyone else, we were caught off guard by how fast everything unfolded. We needed to go to ground right away. All the students were sent home from the residential CFC campus and did not return. We tried to bring them back in December, only to have everyone sent home again in a panic because of Omicron. Everyone has been frightened, worried, not sure how COVID was going to go, and we were suddenly all distance teaching faculty entering into what we called emergency remote teaching mode. And it is in that spirit that wargaming really came into its own at CFC. Rahm Emanuel's quote, he said it for sure, sometimes it's attributed to Churchill as well. It sort of became the faculty mantra among the academics at CFC, and certainly my own personal slogan, because suddenly all institutional and bureaucratic inertia was removed at the college. Everything needed to change all at once, and frankly, the change was going to be dominated by people who were willing to put in the work to make it happen on short notice. My own background in wargaming really helped out here. In April of 2020, I was given permission by the leadership to start developing and incorporating a series of virtual war games into our now fully online curriculum to replace some of the modules that were filled with Zoom seminars or the dreaded threaded discussions. This was the first serious attempt to bring wargaming back into the curriculum in most of a decade. So what exactly were the college's wargaming requirements? Well, there was never a formal statement of needs or anything because this was all being done on the fly in the midst of an emergency. In many ways, it was the parameters of the emergency itself that defined what our needs were. I note that this was for early on in the pandemic as the needs of the wargaming program at CFC have changed since then. But all of these points had a significant influence on what we developed and the kind of the pathways that we took. We need to deliver mass war games for the entire Joint Command and Staff program or for a specialist stream course. So somewhere between 30 to 40 or 120 people, and also had to cope with limited facilitation and adjudication resources. We had to deliver via existing pre-approved college software platforms because these games were going to be played primarily on the college-issued computers that the students had taken home to ensure a uniform access experience, and that ruled out Steam, Vassal, Foundry altogether without going through a screening process with IT if we wanted different platforms. They had to align with existing curriculum learning objectives. To achieve full constructive alignment, that makes it harder to use pre-existing tabletop games. So that pretty much demanded custom jobs. Relatively low bandwidth. This was a CFC problem, especially in the early months of the pandemic. I won't get into it, but our IT department was not resourced and did not have the infrastructure to do what we were asking it to do, which was take the entire program online at the drop of a hat. And finally, we wanted to privilege asynchronous play as well. And by that, I mean that this wasn't a case of everyone sitting down for a couple of hours around a game board and playing the game. We have students scattered all across Canada's many time zones, most of them with kids at home because of the early lockdowns. Everyone was losing their minds. And so if we wanted a robust game, we were going to have to let the teams self-organize to best suit themselves. So what we really needed was something kind of like a play-by-mail game of chess or diplomacy. You submit the orders once or twice a day, but there's no requirement for the teams to be synchronously connected with one another at any particular time except for the debriefing and discussion. I should also mention that we had very little time for playtesting ahead of time with these. When a major new game or a redevelopment of a game is launched at CFC, we typically try to get in a big playtest ahead of time, but there's a lot of on-the-fly wargaming happening and a constant process of development and redevelopment and processing of lessons learned to build iterations very quickly for the next playthrough. So these myriad requirements meant that many of the traditional tools for delivering online war games weren't going to work. We faced an uphill battle in getting a number of these things approved for CFC devices by our IT department. For now, these are the only tools that we've used to deliver war games, none of which have been automated or had automatic components to them. They're effectively giant board games which White Cell runs by hand in PowerPoint. Orders and results are posted to Moodle, our college's learning software, and Zoom is the primary platform for synchronous meetings, though this was recently changed this year, replaced by MS Teams at the college, which is notably inferior for running games. Teams does, however, have a beautiful level of integration with other Microsoft software platforms that have helped facilitate white cell coordination in other ways. So we try to use all of these tools. Maps and hexagon grids done with the GIMP image editor, all the icons, meeples, what have you, were put together very pleasantly in PowerPoint. As I said, there's very little automation software deployed in any of these games. Almost all of them require manual adjudication and manipulation via a white cell, typically me, and some extremely overworked curriculum design officers at the college. There is scope for further development and improvement there, but that's a big step down the road in terms of setting up a more permanent wargaming cell at CFC, as it exceeded my personal ability to implement. So I want to talk about, spend the rest of my time here discussing some of the four streams of war games that we've developed at CFC over the last few years and implemented, as well as say a few words about the DS 501, Defense Studies 501 class that I have been running for over the past rotation, the past semester at CFC. This really began with exercise GOSSAMER, which was first delivered in May of 2020 for one of the advanced warfighting stream at CFC. It started off as a replacement for the targeting module and emphasized the relationships between kinetic and non-kinetic effects on don't call it the Baltic, but on a thinly veiled substitute for the Baltic that I've called Baltica. This was an opposed game, free play, no scripted effects. The different sides, the NATO side versus the Red Team Federation, if you will, had a slew of hybrid options open to them in terms of how they wanted to approach a particular crisis. And we ran through it a couple of times with the students, and different teams had different objectives, and were able to create a slew of different effects. It worked really well for trying to focus on what some of the important elements of the targeting cycle were. And I should mention that this is not a game to teach the targeting cycle. We're not the targeting school. This is a game to help the participants think about targeting and think about some of the complexities that are raised by the targeting process. GOSSAMER went very well. We're now on the 4th iteration of GOSSAMER. This one's going to be delivered in May of 2022. I am currently doing a major redevelopment on it, kind of taking a pan-domain perspective on it now, and shifting from just that kinetic, non-kinetic stance into something a little more complicated, where we marry up some of the thinking about the domains, and thinking about the armed forces functions, act, shield, sense, sustain, command, in order to create game effects within this world. We also have a more robust naval component. I am an Army historian by training, and I tend to forget about the boats if left to my own devices, which has proven to be a bit of a problem. So this time there is a far more robust naval component that we will be implementing within this game, while retaining the focus upon kind of a free play hybrid scenario that will allow a lot of complexity to be captured. The other major game that we've been working on is called Exercise Runtime. And this started in May of 2020 as a replacement for the cyber module in the course. And it was essentially initially it was a rerun of Exercise GOSSAMER, except with a new layer of cyber rules placed on top of it. And the cyber rules were developed in consultation with some cyber operators from the Canadian Armed Forces, who donated very generously their time and their expertise to make sure that this was capturing some of the fundamentals of how to think about cyber operations. And the first iteration was good, but we found that there was some of the lessons of cyber operations were actually kind of being sidelined in this larger game about hybrid warfare, and especially when Red Cell decided that they were going to go full Panzer's West and launch a massive conventional attack. Suddenly, the cyber elements of the game were put on the sideline, and which was an important lesson at the time. But I've since been in a process of trying to take runtime, that cyber layer of rules, and put them more front and center. Last year, we did Exercise Runtime 2, which posited a fictional scenario and really put the emphasis upon just the cyber rules, with a few other connected elements of conventional and unconventional warfare, in the form of essentially a capture the flag game set in a very fictional world. This was again. I thought this was a success, and I thought it was thought it went a really long ways towards helping students, especially students from outside of cyber trades, grasp some of the fundamentals of what the of cyber operations. But again, there were a lot of distractions in that game on the non-cyber front, and so what I was, and so even though it was a lot more, it was very whittled down in terms of getting rid of some of the more extraneous elements of what we were of the game. There's still work to be done on that. And so this year we're doing exercise runtime 3, and this is a further winnowing down. We're dispensing entirely with the pretense of any international relations or fictional countries or whatnot, and it's a straight capture the flag game that is meant to be a competition between the different syndicates. I believe we'll have 7 syndicates across both our 03 and our 05 programs that are going to be playing this game against one another, thinking about fundamentals of strategic cyber operations. And there are important elements in terms of both physical and the relationship of physical infrastructure to digital infrastructure, the cyber kill chain, if you will, the implementing of firewall defense, of the importance of network hygiene and illumination. There's a number of different lessons that are drawn out in this game. This is a map that's currently under development, but when this goes live in April, what they will be doing is that each team will be assembling its own essential internal network. Each of those black spaces on the board represents cyberspace within their each team's individual cyberspace, and the actual cartographic elements there represent the physical world. I wanted something that was going to be able to capture both of these aspects, so you can have both physical interference in cyber processes and a robust look at some of the digital aspects of cyber operations as well. I'm quite optimistic that this is going to work well. And that we've finally we've shed just about everything that is extraneous to this particular exercise, and so we can really focus on the fundamentals and the essentials without as many distractions. Now, the other exercises the other major exercise I've been involved with in the past is called JOINTEX. This was actually an exercise that I developed when I was teaching at Queen's University and then at the Royal Military College of Canada in a lesser capacity. It was originally a planning exercise that was meant to kind of introduce civilian students and then officer cadets to some of the complexities of planning and components and the clash of different service interests. And we brought it to CFC, and with some modification, we ran it in January of 2021. It is it is an exercise based on Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, and really with the teams broken down into a number, or the syndicates broken down into a number of different teams, each of which is trying to contribute to the overall success of the invasion, but also has its own objectives, its own private service objectives in order to that they want to achieve. So it's very negotiation based, and it was a success for what we wanted it to be. But the main comment we got was that what they really wanted was this to be an imposing force exercise, because it originally wasn't. It was all negotiation based within the Allied side, and then we didn't actually play out the war game. And that was a major complaint. So this year we did what I call JOINTEX Red, which is the incorporation of a red cell, which was who were my students from my wargaming class, who sat as the enemy force within this as the Axis forces. We did this as a major week-long exercise, and this time we had the basic elements of negotiation between the services and between the teams was still absolutely necessary. Each team controlled only their own assets, and they had to work together to try to plan a major joint operation. And this fits our curriculum really well because it is a part of our DS 545 component capabilities course, and this allows, and the component capabilities is really about building empathy and understanding among future senior officers to try to get them to bridge some of those gaps between the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Special Forces. And it's an empathy building exercise and trying to look at like what our partners within the armed forces do. And one of the problems have been identified that in the component capabilities was that we would go straight from component capabilities to the operational planning process without thinking about how to actually create joint operations and how to create joint effects within existing resources. So JOINTEX was implemented here to try to bridge that gap, and I think it does so really well. We did we put the students in twindicates, so 2 syndicates a piece, broke them down into teams from there. We had 6 games simultaneously running, and we played through one turn where Blue would, the Allied side, would get to put together their invasion plan and execute it. Red would then get a response or get their counterattack in, and then we would end it there. So it wasn't about the complete conquest of Sicily, just the initial landings. And then we had JOINTEX 2, which was something approved by our former director of programs, Colonel Barbara Hoenig. Last year, she called it the Cyberpunk JOINTEX, which was a second-week exercise, basically a reset of JOINTEX Red, and posited a counterfactual where we now gave both sides cyber and space capabilities. And it's wildly ahistorical, but it doesn't matter because we're not trying to recreate Operation Husky. We're trying to build empathy among the different components. We're trying to understand how the cyber and space domains can be enabling or disruptive. So it remained essentially the same thing, but with again with that new layer of rules placed on top of it. And this was a big success as well. And this was the results were very different, partly because of some of the rule changes, but partly because of the implementation of these different domains layered on top of what was going on. I think I'm running out of time, so I will briefly say the new edition for this year that I'm currently working on is called Exercise Phoenix Down. This is kind of the endpoint for the operational planning process that we're doing at CFC. They have their Exercise Phoenix Thunder and then Exercise Phoenix Rising are the tutorial and then the actual OPP exercise. And then they end off with Exercise Phoenix Down, which is a war game that I'm developing on the Free Kriegspiel model that is meant to take the plans that they have so laboriously put together in OPP and, as one of my friends on the directing staff says, to hexagonalize it and to kind of abstract the units, the positioning and so forth onto a game board, and then spend a week essentially fighting it out and seeing what might have happened with their plan in an abstracted rule space. And this will, we're really enthusiastic about this because that was always one of the letdowns of the OPP was you never really got to see the plan in action, of course. So this was requested early on, I think late last year that I work on developing this. Uses the Zoran C scenario from the CFC uses as the basis for its OPP, and goes from there. So that's still under development. This was a little less intensive because the Free Kriegspiel model is going to place a lot of emphasis on expert adjudicators and bringing them in to resolve conflicts and make decisions rather than having an extensive rigid rule book like we do with most of the other games. And finally, I'll briefly say one of the things I've been most pleased with is the DS501 Wargaming Complementary Studies class that I've been teaching. This is not just about playing war games, but this is about thinking about them as a subject of academic study, thinking about design, how to use them professionally, incorporating them to answer questions within the students' own trades and careers. Their final deliverables are due shortly, but we've got 8 wonderful games. I can't believe there's been some incredible innovation that people have been bringing to this. Each game as well needs to incorporate a GBA plus content, gender-based analysis, content and considerations. So not just accessibility for the game itself. Of course, we've got some people who are focused on who have done some amazing work on making sure that their games are colorblind sensitive, for instance. But I also will be assessing them based on how they grapple with GBA plus considerations within the gameplay itself. And this has forced a lot of people who are developing, straight tactical games and, platoon strike command games to think about, well, how are we going to center these GBA plus considerations? Like what are the human security implications and of the game that's being played out here? How are we going to grapple with that better? And they have risen to the occasion, and they have done a fabulous job of incorporating all of those considerations. Okay, I think that's it for me. So if you have, I'll send it back to Ben for questions. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Robert. That's a fascinating brief with some really interesting work that's been done in really short period of time, which is good to see. We have got a number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to just run through them in some kind of order. Okay, so one of the questions was what was the rationale for building your own worlds for your games rather than using something like decisive action training environment?
Part of it was that we didn't have early on we did not have access within the college. We do not have existing relationships, existing access to this software to be able to build it. In the years since, I think we probably could, but in some ways, because of the curriculum design process, it's been easier to continue using what we're doing, and that I think it underlines the need for a robust look at CFC of what the future of wargaming is going to be, because there's a lot of software platforms and such that are approved within the forces to be able to deliver wargaming content like this that we could potentially use. We haven't used them to date, in part because those relationships don't exist and need to be established and created. But there's also a workload issue in terms of setting up our own fictionalized worlds and such. I got into trouble early on for positing a Baltic scenario when we're not actually supposed to name real world enemies within our war games and such, as a matter of policy within the government of Canada, because it is in fact a very subtle signaling tool that is used that Canada opts not to do. And that was I learned that the hard way early on with exercise GOSSAMER. So I have, if that's the other aspect of the question, that's one of the reasons why I have been placing the emphasis upon either historical scenarios or completely fictionalized settings.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Another question here on the effectiveness of cyber operations. Can you say anything about how you measure and adjudicate the effectiveness of cyber operations and their attribution?
Yeah, we use a system that I've developed. It's not terribly different from like a combat results table within many commercial war games to determine the effectiveness. It's largely a matter. Well, I'm happy to share any details. I'll tell you what. It might be a long and complicated answer to get into like the measuring of the metrics and capabilities. What we try to do, all of these games are unclassified. So I think that probably the easy way to spell this out is that we tend to emphasize the effects rather than the processes. We can talk about like what effects are being achieved without talking specifically about within cyber, without talking about the processes that are actually used in detail to be able to do that. And that was what some of the advice that was given to me by the CAF operators, is that if we want to keep this in the unclassified realm, we really have to focus upon the effects that are being created. So we've abstracted a lot of the processes of for intrusion and such, so that students can understand the fundamentals of it while keeping it within the unclassified realm. I'll be happy to share any further details on the exact mechanics and playbook at a future time. But I think we'll quickly run out of time if I start yabbering on about that.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So just looking at some of the other questions. We actually have a live question from Wayne. We have a hand up. Wayne, do you want to ask a question in person?
Thank you. Actually, it's not a question. Just to back you up, Robert, I'll talk a little bit more about it this afternoon, but nations are typically reluctant to use real scenarios, real political boundaries, real geography, and so on. And I'll go into that. So I totally back up the government of Canada and you in making it fictional.
Okay, and I can see there's a rich discussion of this sort of going on in the text as well, which is always a good place where the conference within the conference is going on in the text channel. So another question here about, I guess it may be related to the cyber issue. There's a question in exercise runtime 3. This is from Crystal 2. What kinds of critical infrastructure were included in the game, and how the sort of attacks upon them and play out within the gameplay and so on. So I guess it's the interaction between those non-standard parts and the sort of and the physical war game.
Yeah, this is where I've been abstracting quite a lot in terms to make the games both playable and easy to comprehend. So critical infrastructure tends to in these games tends to have a number of different effects, but is largely undifferentiated in and of itself. There are in the original in runtime 2, we had critical infrastructure, we had research labs, we had a number of different markers and such that represented broad swaths of society that could be targeted, and a number of different effects could be achieved by placing different kinds of malware on those markers. And that we've kept that idea for runtime 3. In runtime 3, critical infrastructure is largely powering and providing support and resources to several other markers. So targeting that can cause a significant collapse or degradation of the team that is attempting to that you're targeting. But we're not getting too, there's not too much granularity there, because I've found particularly with the runtime games, which are introducing the majors and as well as O3s and O5s to some of these concepts, sometimes for the first time, that there are limits to how much granularity and how much detail you need, and how much versus how much complexity and difficulty in playing the game is ramping up as a result. So I've tended to keep it fairly abstract, and I think that is as a way to keep the game moving while still being able to capture some of the fundamentals. It's not a substitute for really learning about cyber operations, but it is a good way to meet some of the learning objectives in terms of understanding the fundamentals within CFC.
Great, thank you. So I think one further question. I'm going to merge a couple of questions that have been asked and paraphrase them. When you have your games, players are given assets that have certain capabilities. Do you vary? Do people play with sort of ideal as about to be? Do you give some people sort of limited capabilities, perhaps representing sort of out of date, sort of previous generation equipment, or futuristic, as we'd like to have sort of futuristic sort of? Do you play with variations between them, or are you sort of standardizing on a sort of as ideally would like to be tomorrow kind of sort of?
That depends very sharply upon the game. For runtime, which is again largely a capture the flag game, that doesn't matter as much. I tend to be looking more at game balance and making sure that everyone has a fair start in that game. For things like GOSSAMER or JOINTEX, then the differentiating the units and thinking about the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these tokens is a major part of what we're trying to do. And that's what I'm thinking of for the GOSSAMER 4 in particular, when we're kind of marrying the domains and the functions together to give like combined strength and to emphasize that every unit has different capabilities within different domains and can operate in different domains to different degrees, and will have strengths assigned to them on the basis of the outdatedness of their equipment or anyway, there's a number of different factors that can go into building those particular units. And I spent a lot of time putting together each of the individual units, trying to capture that with as much nuance as I can. So it depends on the game and what we're trying to abstract, because that force mix and the effects of different of having different capabilities within your forces is really important for GOSSAMER, less important for runtime. And so we try to abstract to what is important as much as possible, and get clear everything else out of that. I found that's one of the most important things for doing wargaming at this level at CFC, is the ability to abstract and to know what needs to be abstracted.
Okay, excellent. No, thank you. That's an interesting perspective. So we'll just come to the end of this session, of the segment now. I'll just sort of explain, I think, to those people who may be from outside the Canadian federal sort of family. Robert mentioned the GBA Plus. This stands for Gender-Based Analysis Plus. It's a sort of federal government approach to making sure there aren't sort of hidden, buried in accidental sort of biases built into things that would exclude certain members of the population from any particular perspective, not necessarily gender. So it's GBA Plus is something we're supposed to apply to everything that we're developing. So thank you very much, Robert. That's a great presentation. Taking your sort of initial comment about the years you spent in your youth, I think if you added up the total number of years spent moving pieces of cardboard over hexagonal maps or exploring underground passageways looking for the secret exit, of the people on this call here, you would probably have several lifetimes consumed. So you are among fellow sufferers or friends, depending which way you want to look at it. So thank you very much for your contribution, and welcome to Connection.